In the spaces between what we know and what we remember, in the silence that follows the last witness, in the dust that settles over abandoned places where laughter once echoed, there live the mysteries that time could not solve. These are the vanishings that haunt the edges of history, the disappearances that left behind only questions written in wind and shadow. Tonight, as the world grows quiet around you, let these gentle puzzles of the past carry you into peaceful darkness, where the unsolved becomes a lullaby and the unknown transforms into the softest of dreams. Here, in this space between sleeping and waking, the lost speak in whispers, telling stories of how things simply fade away. If this journey into history gently moves you, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more sleepy minds find their way here. By the way, where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment before you drift off. We read every single one. On Roanoke Island, where the Atlantic whispers secrets to the Carolina shore, a mystery was born in the space of 3 years that would outlive empires. The year was 1587, and English dreams of New World settlement hung as delicate as morning mist over the waters. Sir Walter Raleigh's vision had taken root in the form of 115 souls, men, women, and children, who carried with them the weight of expectation and the fragile hope of making something lasting from nothing at all. John White stood on the deck of his departing ship, watching the island shrink into the horizon, his heart heavy with the impossible choice he had made. Behind him, in that small settlement carved from wilderness, he left his daughter Eleanor and his granddaughter Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, her cry at birth a declaration that the New World would not remain untouched by European ambition. But the sea called him back to England for supplies, for reinforcements, for the 1,000 necessities that a fragile colony required to survive another winter. 3 years stretched between his departure and return. 3 years during which war with Spain made the Atlantic a graveyard of ships and dreams. When White finally returned to Roanoke in 1590, he found something that would puzzle historians for centuries to come. Silence. The settlement stood empty, not destroyed by violence or scattered by storm, but simply vacant. Houses remained, their doors open to the wind. Personal possessions lay where they had been placed, as if their owners had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. The only clue was a single word carved into a wooden post: Croatoan. No cross above it, which had been the agreed signal for distress. No signs of struggle, no bodies. Just that one word pointing toward Croatoan Island, 20 miles south, where friendly Native Americans lived. But when White tried to reach Croatoan, storms drove his ship away, and he never returned to search for the colonists again. The 115 people of Roanoke had become something more haunting than memory. They had become a question that time refused to answer. In the centuries that followed, theories bloomed like wildflowers in spring. Some believed the colonists had joined with the Croatoan people, intermarrying and creating a hybrid community that gradually dissolved into the larger Native American population. Archaeological evidence has suggested this possibility, with European artifacts found in Croatoan settlements and genetic markers in local Native American communities that hint at European ancestry from the correct time period. Others imagined darker fates, starvation during a harsh winter, disease sweeping through the settlement like a grim harvest, or conflict with hostile tribes that left no survivors to tell the tale. But these theories struggled against the evidence of the undisturbed settlement, the careful carving of Croatoan, and the absence of any signs of violence or hasty departure. Perhaps most romantically, some theorized that the colonists had attempted to return to England on their own, building boats from the abundant timber and launching themselves into the vast Atlantic. In this version of events, they disappeared into the ocean's embrace, their fate sealed by storms or navigation errors that left them lost between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Modern archaeology has added new chapters to the Roanoke story without solving its central mystery. Excavations have revealed evidence of the colonists' daily lives: pottery fragments, tools, jewelry, and the remains of their fort. But these discoveries only deepen the puzzle. The artifacts suggest a community that was functioning normally, right up until the moment of disappearance. There are no signs of gradual abandonment, no evidence of a community slowly failing and dispersing. Instead, the archaeological record suggests that 115 people were living their lives, making pottery, repairing tools, and planning for the future. And then, suddenly, they weren't. December 1872 found the Atlantic Ocean in one of its more contemplative moods, its waves rolling in long, slow rhythms beneath a sky that couldn't decide between storm and sunshine. Captain David Morehouse of the merchant ship Dei Gratia was navigating these uncertain waters when his lookout spotted something that would become one of the sea's most enduring puzzles. A ship sailing alone on the horizon, her movement erratic, purposeless, like a dancer who had forgotten the music. The vessel was the Mary Celeste, a two-masted brigantine that should have been carrying Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and 7 crew members, from New York to Genoa with a cargo of industrial alcohol. But as Morehouse's men boarded the Mary Celeste, they discovered something that defied rational explanation. The ship was completely abandoned, yet perfectly seaworthy, sailing herself through the Atlantic with ghostly determination. The scene that greeted the boarding party was one of eerie normalcy interrupted. In the captain's cabin, Briggs's personal effects remained undisturbed. His logbook lay open, the last entry dated 10 days earlier, recording their position near the Azores with no indication of trouble. Sarah Briggs's jewelry box sat on the dresser, her belongings carefully arranged as if she might return at any moment. Little Sophia's toys were scattered about the cabin floor, frozen in the middle of whatever game she had been playing when what? The ship's cargo of industrial alcohol was intact, though several barrels had been found open, their contents partially evaporated. The crew's quarters showed no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Personal belongings remained in their places. The ship's papers were missing, along with the ship's chronometer, sextant, and the ship's boat, suggesting a deliberate abandonment rather than a sudden catastrophe. Most mysteriously, the Mary Celeste showed no signs of damage that would explain why 10 people would abandon a seaworthy vessel in the middle of the ocean. Her hull was sound, her rigging intact, her sails properly set. She had been sailing herself for days, perhaps weeks, like a faithful horse returning home without its rider, guided by some nautical instinct that kept her moving forward even as her human purpose had vanished into the salt air. The theories that emerged to explain the Mary Celeste's abandonment were as varied as they were unsatisfying. Some suggested that fumes from the alcohol cargo had created an explosion risk, causing Captain Briggs to order a temporary evacuation. In this scenario, the ship's boat would have been attached by a line, but storms could have snapped the connection, leaving the evacuees to perish while the Mary Celeste sailed on alone. Others proposed mutiny, imagining a crew driven to desperation by harsh conditions or the lure of the valuable cargo. But this theory struggled against the evidence. Nothing was stolen, and the crew's personal belongings remained untouched. If the crew had murdered the captain and his family, why would they then abandon a profitable ship and cargo? Pirates offered another explanation, but again the evidence didn't support it. Pirates would have taken the cargo and likely the ship itself. They certainly wouldn't have left behind valuable personal effects or carefully maintained the ship's sailing trim. The Mary Celeste had not been plundered. She had been vacated. More exotic theories involved sea monsters, underwater earthquakes that created false horizons, or even supernatural intervention. Arthur Conan Doyle, writing fiction, inspired by the Mary Celeste, helped fuel public imagination with stories of revenge and mysterious forces at sea. But these dramatic explanations seemed to miss the essential strangeness of the mystery. Not that something terrible had happened, but that nothing terrible seemed to have happened at all. Modern maritime experts have suggested that a seaquake might have created a waterspout that appeared to threaten the ship, causing the captain to order a temporary evacuation. In rough seas, the boat could have been swept away before the passengers could return to the ship. This theory has the advantage of explaining both the hasty but orderly departure and the fact that the ship remained undamaged. Yet perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Mary Celeste mystery is not what happened to her passengers, but how she continued her journey alone. For days or weeks, she sailed through Atlantic waters, her sails catching wind, her rudder responding to the sea's movements, as if the ship herself had developed a will to continue the voyage that her human crew could not complete. In this, she became something more than an abandoned vessel. She became a meditation on persistence, on the way some journeys continue even after their original purpose has dissolved into mystery. The morning of July 2nd, 1937, dawned clear over New Guinea, where Amelia Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan prepared for what should have been one of the final legs of their around-the-world flight. Their Lockheed Electra sat on the tarmac at Ley Airfield, fuel tanks filled to capacity for the 2,556-mile journey to Howland Island, a tiny speck of coral and sand in the vast Pacific Ocean. Earhart had already captured the world's imagination. As a pioneer of aviation, a woman who transformed the sky from a male domain into a space of infinite possibility. But on this morning, she was about to become something even more lasting, a question written in wind and silence. The flight plan was ambitious even by Earhart standards. Howland Island was barely 2 miles long and half a mile wide, a needle in the Pacific haystack that required precision navigation over thousands of miles of empty ocean. The US Coast Guard had positioned the cutter Itasca near Howland to provide radio guidance, and beacons had been set up to help guide the Electra to its destination. Everything that could be planned had been planned, but the Pacific Ocean had its own thoughts about human ambition. Radio communications between Earhart and the Itasca began normally as the Electra approached the search area. Her voice crackled through the static, professional but increasingly tense as fuel ran low and Howland Island remained invisible below the clouds. "We are on the line 157-337, running on line north and south," she transmitted at 8:43 a.m. "We are running on line north and south." Those were among the last words clearly received from Amelia Earhart. At 8:46 a.m., her final recorded transmission cut through the Pacific silence. "We are on the line 157-337. We will repeat this message. We will repeat this on 6 to 10 kilocycles. Wait." Then, nothing. The Electra and its 2 occupants had vanished into the blue immensity as completely as if they had never existed. The search that followed was one of the largest and most expensive in aviation history up to that time. Ships and aircraft scoured 250,000 square miles of Pacific Ocean, guided by fragmentary radio signals that may or may not have come from the missing plane. The US Navy deployed ships and aircraft in a massive grid search, while civilian volunteers and foreign governments contributed vessels and expertise. For weeks, the Pacific revealed nothing but its own vast indifference to human hopes. In the decades that followed, theories about Earhart's disappearance proliferated like flowers after rain. The most straightforward explanation was that the Electra had simply run out of fuel and crashed into the Pacific Ocean, sinking to depths that would keep its secrets forever. The ocean floor around Howland Island plunges to over 14,000 feet, deep enough to swallow aircraft and leave no trace for surface searchers. But other theories captured more public imagination. Some believed that Earhart and Noonan had landed on Gardner Island, now Nikumaroro, about 350 miles southeast of Howland. This coral atoll had a flat area that might have served as an emergency landing strip, and radio signals received in the days after the disappearance could have come from the Electra stranded on the reef. In this scenario, Earhart and Noonan survived the landing, but eventually succumbed to heat, thirst, or injury. while waiting for rescue that never came. Archaeological expeditions to Nikumaroro have found intriguing artifacts. A piece of aluminum that could have come from an Electra, a woman's shoe from the 1930s, and bone fragments that might belong to a person of Earhart's approximate height and build. But none of these discoveries has provided definitive proof, and the island keeps its secrets as closely as the ocean keeps its depths. More dramatically, some theorize that Earhart and Noonan had been captured by the Japanese, either as spies or as unfortunate witnesses to Japanese military preparations in the Pacific. In this version of events, they were taken to Saipan or another Japanese-controlled island, where they died in captivity. Local witnesses in Saipan claim to have seen a white woman and man who could have been the missing aviators, but these accounts were often contradictory and impossible to verify decades after the fact. The most romantic theory suggested that Earhart had survived and assumed a new identity, living quietly in the United States under an assumed name. Proponents of this theory pointed to photographs of women who resembled Earhart and to unverified accounts of mysterious female figures who appeared to have aviation knowledge. But these stories required believing that Earhart would have allowed the world to mourn her death while she lived anonymously, a possibility that seemed to contradict everything known about her character and her commitment to advancing women's opportunities in aviation. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Earhart's disappearance is how it transformed her from a pioneering aviator into something larger, a symbol of the unknown, of journeys that lead beyond the edge of the map. Her Electra had been carrying her around the world, but when it vanished, it carried her into a kind of immortality. She became the aviator who flew into forever. Her story forever suspended at the moment when her voice faded from the radio and her plane dissolved into Pacific blue. In the end, the mystery of Amelia Earhart's disappearance may matter less than what it represents. The eternal human desire to push beyond known boundaries, to explore spaces where maps end and imagination begins. Her final flight became a meditation on the relationship between ambition and mystery, between the human need to understand and the universe's occasional refusal to provide answers. In the valleys of the Indus River, where Pakistan and northwestern India now stretch toward the horizon, archaeologists have uncovered one of humanity's greatest puzzles. The remains of a civilization so advanced, so sophisticated, that its sudden disappearance around 1900 BCE left a void in human history that has never been satisfactorily explained. The Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization, flourished for nearly a millennium, building cities that would not look out of place in the modern world, and then vanished so completely that their very existence was forgotten, until British archaeologists began digging in the 1920s. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, the twin capitals of this lost world, were marvels of urban planning that would not be matched in the ancient world for centuries after their abandonment. Streets laid out in perfect grids, sophisticated drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, and multi-story buildings that spoke of a society that valued order, efficiency, and public welfare above individual display of wealth. These were not cities built around temples or palaces, but around the practical needs of urban life, commerce, sanitation, and the orderly movement of people and goods. Walking through the excavated remains of Mohenjo-Daro today, one can see the ghost of a city that understood water management in ways that would impress modern engineers. Every house had access to a private well, and every house was connected to a sophisticated sewerage system that carried waste away from residential areas. Public baths, wide streets designed for wheeled traffic, and grain storage facilities that could feed a large population. All of these suggested a civilization that had solved many of the practical problems that plague urban societies even today. Yet for all their obvious sophistication, The Harappans left behind no deciphered written records, no clear religious texts, no royal monuments celebrating great kings or military victories. Their script, found on thousands of seals and pottery fragments, remains undeciphered despite decades of scholarly effort. Without written records, the Harappan people remain silent, their thoughts and beliefs as mysterious as their ultimate fate. The artifacts they left behind suggest a remarkably peaceful and egalitarian society. Unlike other ancient civilizations, Harappan sites show little evidence of warfare, slavery, or extreme differences in wealth. Their art focused on animals, nature, and geometric patterns, rather than glorifying rulers or military conquests. Their cities had no obvious palaces or royal quarters, suggesting either a remarkably egalitarian society or a form of government so different from other ancient civilizations that archaeologists have struggled to understand it. Trade networks connected the Harappan cities to regions as distant as Mesopotamia and Central Asia. Harappan seals have been found in Sumerian cities, and Mesopotamian artifacts have been discovered in Indus Valley sites, suggesting a civilization that was actively engaged with the wider ancient world. Their merchants sailed down the Indus River to the Arabian Sea, and from there to the Persian Gulf, carrying goods and ideas across thousands of miles of land and water. But around 1900 BCE, this remarkable civilization began to fade. The archaeological record shows a gradual decline rather than sudden destruction. Cities were abandoned, trade networks collapsed, and the sophisticated urban culture that had flourished for centuries simply stopped. By 1300 BCE, the great cities of the Indus Valley were ghost towns, their streets empty, their sophisticated water systems silted up, their people scattered or absorbed into other cultures. Theories for the Harappan collapse are as varied as they are unsatisfying. Climate change may have played a role, with shifting monsoon patterns reducing the water supply that the cities needed to sustain their large populations. The Indus River itself may have changed course, leaving cities without access to the water and trade routes that had made them possible. Archaeological evidence suggests that the river system underwent major changes during this period, possibly due to tectonic activity that altered the landscape. Other theories focus on human factors: invasion by Indo-Aryan peoples from the northwest, internal political collapse, or economic disruption caused by the breakdown of trade relationships with Mesopotamia. But none of these explanations fully accounts for the gradual nature of the decline or the apparent lack of violence in most Harappan sites. Perhaps most mysteriously, the Harappan people seem to have simply dispersed into the larger population of South Asia, their distinctive culture absorbed into other traditions without leaving clear traces. Unlike other ancient civilizations that left lasting impacts on language, religion, or political structures, the Harappans seem to have vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only their beautifully planned cities and their undeciphered script as testimony to their remarkable achievements. In recent years, underwater archaeology has revealed that the disappearance of the Indus Valley civilization may be part of an even larger pattern of ancient urban collapse. Off the coast of India, archaeologists have discovered the remains of what may be even older cities, submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. These underwater ruins suggest that advanced urban civilizations may have risen and vanished multiple times in South Asian history, each leaving only fragmentary traces of their existence. The mystery of the Harappan civilization reminds us that human achievement is more fragile than we often imagine. A culture that mastered urban planning, created continent-spanning trade networks, and solved the practical problems of city life for hundreds of thousands of people could still vanish, so completely that its very existence was forgotten until modern archaeologists began to dig. In the end, the Harappans became something more haunting than a lost civilization. They became a reminder that even our greatest achievements may be written in sand, waiting for the wind to carry them into the realm of. And so the mists continued, to gather around these ancient riddles, drawing us deeper into realms where fact and legend dance together in the twilight of memory. As one mystery fades into the whisper of wind through empty halls, another emerges from the shadows of time, beckoning us forward into stories that have no endings, only deeper questions wrapped in the soft embrace of eternal wonder. In the misty highlands of northern Britain, where heather covers ancient battlefields and the wind carries echoes of marching feet that ceased their rhythm 2,000 years ago, lies one of Rome's most haunting mysteries. The Legio Nime Hispana, the Ninth Legion, vanished from history as completely as morning dew dissolves in sunlight, leaving behind only questions that drift like fog through the centuries. Picture, if you will, the year 108 CE, when the eagles of Rome cast their shadows across a world that stretched from the burning sands of Egypt to the rain-soaked moors of Caledonia. The Ninth Legion had marched through decades of conquest, their standards gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, their shields bearing the scars of 100 victories. 5,000 men strong, hardened by warfare in Germania, seasoned by campaigns. In Pannonia, they had earned their place among Rome's most trusted legions. Yet somewhere in the mists of northern Britain, this mighty force simply melted away, as if the earth itself had opened to swallow their bronze and iron, their hopes and fears, their letters home that would never be written. The silence that followed their disappearance was so complete that it seemed to absorb even the memory of their existence, leaving only faint traces in the administrative records of a distant empire. The last certain glimpse we have of the Ninth Legion places them at Eboracum, modern-day York, where the stones of their fortress still whisper tales of routine garrison life. Here, in the year 108, they were recorded as present and accounted for, their ranks filled with men from across the empire, Spaniards and Gauls, Germans and Thracians, bound together by the iron discipline that had made Rome master of the known world. But what happened next remains shrouded in the kind of mystery that makes historians pace their studies late into the night, searching for clues that seem always to slip away like shadows at dawn. Did they march north into Scotland, pursuing Caledonian tribes who had dared to raid Roman territory? Did they venture beyond Hadrian's Wall, that mighty barrier of stone and ambition that marked the edge of civilization? Some say they vanished, in the misty valleys beyond the Antonine Wall, where the very landscape seemed hostile to Roman order. The Celtic tribes of the north had proven themselves masters of guerrilla warfare, melting into forests and emerging like phantoms to strike at Roman columns before disappearing again into terrain that seemed to swallow armies whole. Perhaps the Ninth Legion, proud in their strength, marched too confidently into lands where their formations meant nothing, and their discipline could not protect them from enemies who fought like the wind itself. Others whisper of a different fate, one that speaks to the fragile nature of empire and the way civilizations can crumble from within even as they appear strongest from without. Perhaps disease struck them down, one of those sudden plagues that could reduce a mighty army to scattered bones in a matter of weeks. Or perhaps they were transferred eastward to fight in Trajan's Dacian campaigns, their records lost in the chaos of a bureaucracy stretched thin across continents. The archaeological evidence offers only tantalizing fragments, like pieces of a puzzle scattered by time itself. No mass grave has ever been found, no battlefield littered with the distinctive equipment of the Ninth. Instead, there are only hints and whispers. A helmet here, a sword there, fragments of pottery that might once have held the wine or oil that sustained Roman soldiers far from home. In the quiet moments between sleep and waking, one can almost hear them still, the measured tread of hobnailed boots on ancient roads, the creak of leather and jingle of mail, the low conversations of men who spoke of home in a dozen different languages, but shared the common bond of service to an empire that seemed eternal. They marched into the mist one morning, nearly 2,000 years ago, and morning never came again for the 9th Legion. Yet perhaps there is a strange comfort in their mystery, a reminder that even the mightiest powers leave questions in their wake. That history is not merely a catalogue of facts, but a collection of dreams and shadows, of stories that resist easy answers. The 9th Legion has achieved a kind of immortality through their disappearance, living on in the imagination in ways that clear historical records might never have allowed. Across the vast Atlantic, where salt winds carry dreams and disappointments, in equal measure, another vanishing echoes through time with the soft persistence of waves against an empty shore. On a small island off the coast of what would become North Carolina, where live oaks drape their ancient arms in Spanish moss, and the air thick with summer heat carries the memory of hopes that withered like flowers in an unexpected frost, stood the settlement of Roanoke. It was 1587 when 115 souls, men, women, and children, stepped onto the sandy soil of this New World island, their hearts full of the dreams that had carried them across 3,000 miles of ocean. They came seeking freedom, prosperity, a chance to build something new in a land that stretched endless and green beyond the horizon. Among them walked John White, artist and governor, whose delicate watercolors would preserve images of this strange new world, even as the people who inspired them faded into legend. The colonists were not the first to attempt this grand experiment. 3 years earlier, another group had tried to establish England's foothold in America, but they had returned to their homeland, defeated by the harsh realities of life in an unfamiliar wilderness. This new group was different. They brought families, women with children at their breasts, men who intended to stay and build a permanent home beneath these foreign stars. Among the settlers was Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter, heavy with child as she stepped onto the island that summer. Within days of their arrival, she gave birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, a baby whose cries carried across the island like a promise of the future, a symbol of the English determination to make this wild coast their own. But the New World proved a harsh teacher. Supplies ran low faster than expected, and the promised support from England seemed as distant as the stars that wheeled overhead in patterns the colonists were still learning to read. The local tribes, the Croatoan and the Socotan, watched these, pale strangers with a mixture of curiosity and concern, unsure whether these newcomers brought trade or trouble to their ancient lands. By late August, as the summer heat began to break and the first hints of autumn touched the air, John White made the difficult decision to return to England for supplies. He would gather what the colony needed and return by spring, or so he promised his daughter, as he held his granddaughter Virginia for what would prove to be the last time. The ship that carried him away from Roanoke also carried his hopes and fears across waters that suddenly seemed impossibly vast. But 1588 brought war to English waters. Spanish ships crowded the horizon like storm clouds, and every English vessel was pressed into service to defend the realm. The planned relief mission to Roanoke was postponed again and again as England fought for its very survival against the might of Spain. 3 long years passed before John White could arrange passage back to his daughter and the colony he had left in trust to the American wilderness. When he finally returned in August 1590, the island greeted him with silence so complete, it seemed, to have weight, pressing down on the expedition like a physical thing. The fort that had sheltered his people was gone, its timbers scattered or reclaimed by the forest. Houses that had rung with laughter and argument stood empty, their doors hanging open to let in the wind and rain. Not a single soul remained of the 115 people who had waved goodbye 3 years before. The only clues to their fate were carved into trees. Croatoan on one post, crow on another, cut deep into the bark by hands that had vanished as completely as their owners. These cryptic messages seemed to point toward Croatoan Island, some 50 miles to the south, where friendly tribes had offered assistance to the English in happier times. But storms prevented White from sailing south to investigate, and he was forced to return to England with his heart full of questions that would never find answers. What became of the lost colony has puzzled historians and dreamers for more than 4 centuries. Did they move inland, intermarrying with Native American tribes and gradually losing their English identity in the vast American wilderness? Archaeological expeditions have found traces of European materials in Native American sites across the region, suggesting peaceful integration rather than violent conflict. Some believe they attempted to return to England on their own, building boats from the timbers of their houses and launching themselves onto waters that would prove their grave. Others imagine a more sinister fate, with the colonists falling victim to disease, starvation, or conflict with tribes who had grown tired of European presence on their lands. Yet perhaps the most haunting possibility is that they simply walked away from their European identity, choosing to become something new in this new world. In the rolling hills of North Carolina, among communities of mixed heritage, there are families who claim descent from the lost colonists, their surnames echoing those carved into the records of Roanoke, their features suggesting ancestors from across the sea. Virginia Dare, that first English child born in America, has become a symbol of this transformation, her story growing in the telling until she seems less a historical figure than a spirit of the American wilderness itself. In local legends, she lived and loved and raised children of her own, her bloodline flowing like a hidden river through the generations that followed. The mystery of Roanoke speaks to something deeper than historical curiosity. It reminds us that America was built on dreams and disappearances, on the courage of people willing to step into the unknown, and the tragic reality that the unknown sometimes swallows those who dare to challenge it. The lost colony represents all the might-have-beens of American history, all the stories that began with hope and ended in questions that drift like morning mist across the centuries. Deep in the rainforests of Central America, where vines embrace, ancient limestone and howler monkeys announce the dawn with voices that echo through green cathedrals of cecropia and mahogany, stand the ruins of one of humanity's greatest civilizations. Here, among pyramids that pierce the jungle canopy like fingers reaching toward forgotten gods, lies the mystery of the Maya collapse. Not a single moment of vanishing, but a slow fade that took centuries to complete, like a symphony gradually losing its instruments until only silence remains. For over 2,000 years, Maya civilization had flourished across an area that encompassed modern-day Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. Their cities rose from jungle clearings like islands of stone and ceremony, connected by white roads that gleamed in the tropical sun and carried merchants, pilgrims, and armies across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. At the height of their achievement, during what archaeologists call the Classic Period, from roughly 250 to 900 CE, the Maya had created something remarkable in human history. A civilization that combined advanced mathematics and astronomy with profound artistic achievement, complex political systems with deep spiritual wisdom. Their calendar was more accurate than the one used in Europe at the same time. Their understanding of zero preceded its use in the Old World, and their astronomical observations allowed them to predict eclipses, and track the movements of planets with stunning precision. Cities like Tikal, Palenque, and Calakmul held populations that dwarfed contemporary European settlements. Tens of thousands of people lived in these urban centers, creating a complexity of social organization that supported everything from specialized craftsmen to sophisticated courts where rulers claimed descent from the gods themselves. The Maya developed the only fully functional writing system in pre-Columbian America, covering their monuments and buildings with glyphs that recorded everything from historical events to astronomical calculations to the mystical visions of their shamans and kings. Yet by 900 CE, something had begun to go terribly wrong. One by one, the great cities started to empty. Construction projects that had taken decades to complete were abandoned half-finished, their massive stone blocks left where workers had set them down for the last time. The elaborate ceremonies that had marked the passage of sacred time grew less frequent, then stopped altogether. The last dated monuments, those proud records of dynastic achievement that had marked Maya civilization for centuries, suddenly ceased to appear. This was not a collapse in the sense of Rome falling to barbarian armies, or Constantinople surrendering to Ottoman cannons. There were no foreign conquerors to blame, no single catastrophic event that historians could point to as the moment when Maya civilization died. Instead, it was more like a great city gradually losing its population as families quietly packed their belongings and walked away, leaving behind empty houses that slowly surrendered to the patient reclaim of jungle vines. What caused this mysterious abandonment has become one of archaeology's most enduring puzzles. Some scholars point to evidence of prolonged drought, a climatic disaster that would have disrupted the agricultural systems that fed these complex urban societies. The Maya had developed sophisticated methods of water management, building elaborate systems of reservoirs and canals to sustain their cities through the dry season. But their very success may have made them vulnerable when the rains failed for years at a time. Paleoclimatic studies of lake sediments and cave formations suggest that the 9th century brought a series of severe droughts to the Maya region, some lasting for decades. For a civilization that had grown accustomed to abundance, this environmental crisis would have been devastating. Crops failed, trade networks collapsed, and the complex political alliances that held the Maya world together began to fracture under the stress of scarcity. Others see the collapse as primarily social and political, the result of warfare and internal conflict that escalated beyond the civilization's ability to contain it. Maya art and inscriptions from the late Classic period show increasing emphasis on military themes, with rulers boasting of victories over their neighbors, and monuments depicting the capture and sacrifice of rival kings. This constant warfare may have drained resources, disrupted agriculture, and created a cycle of violence that ultimately consumed the very civilization that had created it. Population pressure may have played a role as well. At its peak, Maya civilization supported millions of people in a region that today holds far fewer inhabitants. Intensive agriculture had transformed vast areas of forest into terraced fields and raised gardens, but this system may have reached its ecological limits. Soil exhaustion, deforestation, and the collapse of biodiversity could have created an environmental crisis that made continued urban life impossible. Perhaps most intriguingly, some researchers suggest that the Maya collapse represents something more profound, a crisis of faith that undermined the ideological foundations of their civilization. Maya kings ruled not merely as political leaders, but as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds, responsible for maintaining the cosmic order through elaborate ceremonies and bloodletting rituals. If prolonged drought and social chaos called into question their ability to communicate with the gods, the entire basis of Maya society might have crumbled. Whatever combination of factors caused the collapse, its effects were profound and lasting. Great cities that had bustled with tens of thousands of inhabitants were gradually reclaimed by the forest. Magnificent palaces that had housed royal courts became homes to jaguars and snakes. Temples, where priests had conducted elaborate ceremonies, fell silent except for the calls of tropical birds and the whisper of wind through cecropia leaves. Yet the Maya did not simply vanish. Many of their descendants retreated to smaller settlements, maintaining their languages and customs even as their great urban centers crumbled. In the northern Yucatan, cities like Chichen Itza and Mayapan continued to flourish for centuries after the southern cities had been abandoned. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, they found Maya communities scattered throughout the region, still maintaining many of the traditions and beliefs that had characterized their civilization for millennia. Today, millions of Maya people still live in Central America, speaking languages that descend from those carved into ancient stone monuments and maintaining cultural traditions that connect them to their ancestors who built the Great Pyramids. Their survival reminds us that civilizations may collapse, but cultures can endure, adapting and transforming while preserving essential elements that connect the present to the past. The mystery of the Maya collapse speaks to fundamental questions about the nature of civilizations and their sustainability. It reminds us that even the most sophisticated societies are ultimately dependent on their environment and the social bonds that hold them together. In the ruins of their great cities, covered now by centuries of jungle growth, we can see both the amazing achievements possible when human creativity is given free rein and the fragility that underlies even the mightiest accomplishments. As night falls over the ancient cities, when the last tourist buses have departed and the guards have locked the gates, the forest reclaims its own. Howler monkeys announce the darkness with calls that echo off limestone walls built over 1,000 years. Ago, and bats emerge from caves to dance above plazas where Maya kings once performed sacred dances to ensure the rising of the sun. In these moments, the boundary between past and present seems to dissolve, and we can almost hear the whispers of a civilization that touched the stars and then quietly walked away, leaving only questions carved in stone. The Maya understood time, not as a straight line moving from past to future, but as a great wheel, constantly turning, bringing the past into the present and the present into the future in endless cycles of creation and dissolution. Perhaps in this vision lies the key to understanding their mysterious departure from the stage of history, not as an ending, but as a transformation, a movement from one phase of existence to another, as natural and inevitable as the passage of seasons or the wheeling of stars overhead in the tropical night. In the high desert country of the American Southwest, where red sandstone rises in impossible formations against skies so blue they seem artificial, and where the silence is so complete it has its own voice, lie the abandoned homes of a people whose name has become synonymous with one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. The Anasazi, as they were called by the Navajo who found their ruins centuries later, left behind a landscape dotted with architectural marvels so perfectly adapted to their environment that they seemed to grow from the stone itself. From roughly 100 to 1300 CE, the Anasazi created a complex civilization in what might seem the most unlikely of places, the high mesas and deep canyons of the Four Corners region, where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet in a landscape that appears almost lunar in its austere beauty. Here, where summer temperatures can exceed 100 degrees and winter snows can isolate communities for months at a time, they built not mere shelters, but architectural masterpieces that demonstrate a profound understanding of both engineering and aesthetics. The most famous of their achievements is Mesa Verde, where cliff dwellings nestle into natural alcoves in the sandstone canyon walls, like ancient apartments carved from the living rock. These structures, with their perfectly fitted stone blocks and sophisticated ventilation systems, represent the culmination of centuries of architectural evolution, from simple pit houses to multi-story buildings that could house hundreds of families. But Mesa Verde is only one chapter in a larger story that unfolds across thousands of square miles of high desert. At Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, the Anasazi built what can only be described as an ancient metropolis, with great houses containing hundreds of rooms connected by perfectly straight roads that stretch for miles across the desert. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of these structures, contains over 600 rooms and 40 kivas, circular ceremonial chambers that served as the spiritual heart of Anasazi communities. The engineering sophistication of these structures is remarkable. The Anasazi had no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, and no pack animals, yet they quarried massive stone blocks, transported them across difficult terrain, and lifted them into place to create buildings that have stood for nearly 1,000 years. They developed sophisticated techniques for water management in an environment where rainfall averages less than 10 inches per year, creating systems of dams, reservoirs, and irrigation channels that allowed them to practice agriculture in one of North America's most challenging environments. Their astronomical knowledge was equally impressive. Many Anasazi buildings are aligned with celestial events, the summer and winter solstices, the rising of certain stars, the cycles of the moon. At Chaco Canyon, archaeologists have identified what appears to be a sophisticated solar and lunar observatory, with buildings positioned to mark important dates in the agricultural and ceremonial calendar. This suggests a culture with deep knowledge of natural cycles and a complex understanding of humanity's place in the cosmic order. For over 1,000 years, this civilization flourished, creating a network of communities connected by trade routes that brought seashells from the Pacific coast, copper bells from Mexico, and exotic birds whose feathers adorned ceremonial costumes. The Anasazi were master potters, creating ceramics with geometric designs of stunning complexity and beauty. They were skilled farmers who developed drought-resistant varieties of corn, beans, and squash that allowed them to thrive in an environment that challenged every aspect of human survival. Yet by 1300 CE, something had gone wrong. The Great Construction, projects that had characterized Anasazi civilization for centuries, suddenly stopped. The elaborate road networks that had connected communities across the southwest fell into disuse. Most dramatically, the cliff dwellings and great houses that had been home to thousands of people were abandoned, left empty and silent in the desert heat. The mystery deepens when we consider the apparent haste with which these communities were evacuated. In many sites, archaeologists have found personal possessions, pottery, tools, even food stores, left behind as if the inhabitants expected to return soon, but never did. At Mesa Verde, sandals hang on walls, and baskets sit in corners, as if their owners had simply stepped outside for a moment and forgotten to come back. What could have caused an entire civilization to abandon its most important settlements and disappear into the vastness of the American West? Like the Maya collapse, the Anasazi disappearance probably resulted from a complex combination of environmental, social, and cultural factors that came together in a perfect storm of crisis. Drought appears to have played a major role. Tree ring studies show that the late 13th century brought one of the most severe and prolonged droughts in the region's history, lasting from roughly 1276 to 1299. For a civilization that had developed sophisticated agricultural techniques to deal with the challenges of desert farming, this great drought would have been catastrophic. Wells that had never failed ran dry, crops withered in the fields, and the elaborate water management systems that had sustained large populations became useless decoration in a landscape that seemed determined to reclaim its ancient emptiness. But drought alone cannot explain the completeness of the abandonment. The Anasazi had survived droughts before, and their agricultural techniques were specifically designed to cope with irregular rainfall. Something more fundamental must have been at work. Perhaps a crisis of social organization that left communities unable to cooperate in the face of environmental stress. Archaeological evidence suggests that the final centuries of Anasazi civilization were marked by increasing violence and social tension. Skeletal remains from this period show evidence of malnutrition and trauma, suggesting that the long drought had created competition for scarce resources that escalated into conflict. Some sites show evidence of warfare, with defensive walls and watchtowers that speak to a population under siege. The concentration of population into easily defended cliff dwellings may itself be evidence of this social breakdown. Earlier, Anasazi communities had been spread across the landscape in smaller settlements that took advantage of diverse environmental resources. The move to cliff dwellings, while producing architectural marvels, may have represented a defensive strategy that proved ultimately unsustainable when resources became too scarce to support concentrated populations. Religious and cultural factors may have contributed to the collapse as well. The Anasazi had a complex spiritual relationship with their landscape, viewing themselves as part of an intricate web of relationships that connected the human community to the natural world and the realm of the ancestors. If the Great Drought was interpreted as a sign that this cosmic order had been disrupted, it might have triggered a spiritual crisis that undermined the cultural foundations of their civilization. Where did the Anasazi go when they left their cliff dwellings and great houses? Modern Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, the Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande Pueblos, claim the Anasazi as their ancestors, and linguistic and cultural evidence supports these connections. The disappearance of the Anasazi may thus be better understood as a dispersal and cultural transformation, with populations moving to new areas and adapting their lifeways to changing environmental and social conditions. This interpretation is supported by oral traditions among modern Pueblo peoples, which speak of migrations from the north during times of hardship and conflict. These traditions describe not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual movement of clans and families in search of better conditions, carrying with them the essential elements of their culture while adapting to new environments and circumstances. The mystery of the Anasazi reminds us that civilizations are not permanent fixtures, but dynamic responses to environmental and social challenges. Their sophisticated achievements in architecture, agriculture, and astronomy demonstrate the remarkable creativity that humans can bring to the challenge of living in difficult environments. Their apparent disappearance reminds us that even the most successful adaptations may prove inadequate when conditions change beyond a culture's ability to respond. Today, visitors to Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon can walk through the empty rooms and climb the ancient ladders that once connected different levels of these remarkable structures. In the silence of the high desert, with only the wind through stone doorways and the distant cry of a hawk overhead, it is easy to imagine the vanished inhabitants going about their daily lives, grinding corn, weaving baskets, teaching children the stories that connected them to their ancestors and the land that sustained them. But perhaps the greatest mystery is not where the Anasazi went, but how they achieved so much with so little, creating a civilization of remarkable sophistication in one of North America's most challenging environments. Their legacy lies not in their disappearance, but in their achievements, in the proof they offer that human communities can create beauty and meaning even in the face of seemingly impossible obstacles. In their empty dwellings, carved from living rock and perfectly fitted to their natural settings, they left us a reminder that home is not just a place, but a way of being in the world, a harmony between human needs and natural systems that can create something greater than either could achieve alone. As the sun sets over the high desert, painting the sandstone cliffs in shades of red and gold that seem to glow from within, the Anasazi dwellings merge with their natural surroundings until it becomes difficult to tell where human creation ends and geological formation begins. This perfect integration of culture and landscape may be their greatest achievement, a demonstration that civilizations need not dominate their environments to create lasting beauty and meaning. In the gathering darkness, when the first stars appear in the crystalline desert air, the ancient dwellings seem almost to breathe with the memory of the people who called them home, their absence somehow more present than the stone that remains. Waters that had sustained generations began to whisper warnings of change. The great cities that had thrived for over 4 centuries started to feel the tremors of transformation, not in their foundations of baked brick, but in the very soul of their civilization. Archaeological whispers tell us that around 1900 BCE, the standardized weights began to vary. The precise measurements that had governed trade across thousands of miles started to lose their uniformity. In Harappa, craftsmen found themselves working with tools that no longer matched the exacting standards their fathers had inherited. The change was subtle at first, like a musician gradually falling out of tune, barely noticeable to the casual ear, but profoundly disturbing to those who had built their lives around perfect harmony. The great baths that had been meticulously maintained for generations began to show signs of neglect. Not abandonment, but a shift in priorities that spoke of deeper transformations. The citizens of Mohenjo-Daro, who had once gathered at dawn to perform rituals in the perfectly engineered pools, found their attention drawn to other concerns. Perhaps new spiritual practices had emerged, or perhaps the very meaning of purity had evolved in ways we cannot fully comprehend. In the outlying settlements, the first signs of demographic shift became apparent. Families who had lived in the same houses for generations began to move, not in panic, but with the deliberate pace of people making calculated decisions about their future. Some journeyed eastward toward the Ganges Valley, carrying with them the knowledge of urban planning and water management that would eventually seed new civilizations. Others moved southward, their skills in metallurgy and trade becoming the foundation for communities that would persist long after the great cities had been reclaimed by dust. The writing system that had evolved over centuries to serve the needs of a complex society began to appear less frequently on seals and pottery, not because literacy was declining, but perhaps because the purposes that writing had served were changing. The merchants who had once needed elaborate documentation for their vast trade networks might have found themselves operating in smaller, more personal circles where trust and oral agreements sufficed. As the 18th century BCE approached, the great granaries of Harappa began to show signs of reduced capacity, not because harvests were failing, but because the centralized storage system that had been the backbone of the civilization's food security was gradually being replaced by more localized arrangements. Families and communities began keeping their own reserves, preparing for a future that would demand different strategies for survival. The final chapter of the Indus Valley civilization unfolded not as a dramatic collapse, but as a gradual fade. Like an ancient song being forgotten one verse at a time, the great cities slowly emptied as their inhabitants chose new paths. By 1300 BCE, the streets that had once buzzed with the conversations of merchants from distant lands fell silent, not from catastrophe, but from completion. The civilization had served its purpose, taught its lessons, and passed its knowledge to those who would carry it forward in new forms. Chapter 4. The Lost Legion of Rome in the vast expanse of historical mystery. Few disappearances capture the imagination quite like that of Rome's Ninth Legion. Their story begins not with vanishing, but with the steady tread of hobnailed boots across the cobblestones of imperial expansion, carrying the eagles of Rome to the very edges of the known world. The Legio IX Hispana had earned its name through decades of service in the harsh landscapes of the Iberian Peninsula, where they had learned to fight not just battles, but the very elements themselves. These were soldiers tempered by experience, their armor bearing the scars of countless campaigns, their loyalty to Rome absolute as the Northern Star. When the call came to join the conquest of Britain in 43 CE under Emperor Claudius, they answered, with the practiced efficiency of men who had made warfare their art. For over 60 years, the Ninth Legion served as one of Rome's premier fighting forces in Britain. They built roads that connected distant settlements, constructed fortifications that stood as monuments to Roman engineering, and maintained the Pax Romana across territories that had never known such order. Their camps became the seeds of future cities, their presence a guarantee of stability in a land still learning the ways of empire. The soldiers of the Ninth were not merely warriors, they were engineers, administrators, and diplomats. In their winter quarters at Eboracum, which would one day become York, they established libraries, bathhouses, and temples that brought Roman civilization to the wild northern reaches of Britain. Veterans who had served their 25 years settled nearby, their farms and workshops creating communities that blended Roman efficiency with local traditions. But the north of Britain remained unconquered, a land of mist and mystery where Celtic tribes maintained their independence behind natural fortifications of mountain and moor. The Caledonians and Picts had watched Rome's expansion with the patience of people who understood that time itself could be a weapon. They knew their territory better than any foreign army ever could, and they had learned from observing Roman tactics during decades of limited engagements. Around 108 CE, historical records suggest that the Ninth Legion was stationed at Eboracum when reports arrived of increasing unrest in the unconquered territories. Tribes that had maintained an uneasy peace with Rome were showing signs of coordination, their raids becoming more sophisticated and their retreat routes more carefully planned. The governor of Britain, facing pressure from Rome to either secure the northern frontier or withdraw to more defensible positions, made the fateful decision to launch a punitive expedition. The last clear record we have of the Ninth Legion shows them preparing for a campaign that would take them beyond Hadrian's Wall, into territory where Roman law had never taken root. 5,000 men, including auxiliary units from allied tribes, gathered their supplies and sharpened their weapons for what they believed would be another in a long series of successful campaigns. They had faced rebellious tribes before and had always emerged victorious through superior discipline and tactics. The march north began in the early months of what historians believe was 109 CE. The legion followed established routes as far as the Wall, then pushed into unmapped territory where their engineering skills would be tested against landscapes that seemed designed to thwart organized armies. The soldiers, accustomed to building camps with mathematical precision, found themselves adapting to terrain that offered few flat spaces and fewer sources of fresh water. Local guides, recruited from tribes that claimed loyalty to Rome, led the legion deeper into the highlands where ancient paths wound between standing stones and forgotten burial grounds. The Caledonians had learned that the best way to fight Rome was not to fight at all, but to lead their enemies into places where Roman advantages in equipment and organization became liabilities. As the legion advanced, they began to encounter resistance that seemed to materialize from the landscape itself, ambushes launched from behind carefully camouflaged positions, supply trains that disappeared without trace, and scouts who simply never returned from their patrols. The enemy they faced was unlike any they had encountered before. Warriors who knew every stone and stream, who could vanish into terrain that looked empty to Roman eyes. The highlands of Caledonia in winter presented challenges that no amount of military training could fully prepare soldiers for. Mist that turned familiar landmarks invisible, cold that penetrated even the finest Roman armor, and supplies that had to be carried across terrain where wagons could not follow. The legion that had once marched in perfect formation found itself strung out along narrow mountain paths, vulnerable to attacks that came without warning and ended before effective response was possible. Somewhere in those mist-shrouded highlands, the 9th Legion simply ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Whether they were destroyed in a single decisive battle, gradually worn down through constant harassment, or chose to disappear into the landscape themselves, remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. The eagles that had led them to victory, across 3 continents, vanished into the northern mists, and with them disappeared one of Rome's most experienced legions. The silence that followed their disappearance was profound. No survivors struggled back to Roman outposts with tales of disaster. No captured standards were displayed as trophies by triumphant tribes. No mass graves have been discovered, despite centuries of archaeological investigation. The 9th Legion had simply stepped out of history as completely as if they had never existed at all. In Rome, officials waited for reports that never came. Supply shipments prepared for the Legion's return lay untouched in warehouses, while families expecting news from loved ones received only silence. The bureaucratic machinery of empire, normally so efficient at tracking the movement of every unit, found itself faced with a void where the 9th Legion should have been. Emperor Hadrian, when he visited Britain in 122 CE, ordered the construction of the wall that would bear his name. Whether this was always planned or was a direct response to the loss of the 9th remains a subject of scholarly debate. What seems certain is that Rome never again attempted to permanently occupy the lands where the Legion had vanished, treating the region as if it were protected by forces beyond human understanding. The mystery deepened when archaeologists discovered that records of the 9th Legion had been systematically removed from many official documents. Unlike other units that were disbanded or destroyed in known battles, the 9th simply disappeared from the historical record as if bureaucrats were trying to erase their very existence. This deliberate obscuring of their fate suggests that whatever happened to them was considered too dangerous or embarrassing for Rome to acknowledge. Chapter 5. The Princes in the Tower. In the summer of 1483, within the ancient stones of the Tower of London, 2 young boys played games that would become the subject of one of England's most haunting mysteries. Edward V, aged 12, and his brother Richard, Duke of York, aged 9, had no way of knowing that their innocent laughter echoing through the royal apartments would soon be remembered only as an echo of voices that would never grow old. The Tower, which had served as both palace and prison for over 4 centuries, welcomed the young princes with the same stone indifference it had shown to kings and condemned alike. Built by William the Conqueror as a symbol of Norman power, its walls had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the celebration of victories, and the plotting of treasons. Now it would become the stage for a mystery that would haunt the English imagination for centuries to come. Edward had been crowned king following his father. Edward IV's unexpected death in April 1483, though at 12 years old, he was considered too young to rule without a protector. His uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had been appointed as Lord Protector, a role that should have been temporary until the young king came of age. The arrangement seemed natural enough. Richard had been a loyal brother to Edward IV, a capable military commander, and a man who understood the complexities of governing a kingdom still recovering from the Wars of the Roses. The decision to house the princes in the Tower was presented as a matter of security and tradition. Kings had long used the Tower as a residence before their coronations, and London could be a dangerous place for young royalty. The massive walls and trained guards would protect them from any plots or kidnapping attempts, while preparations continued for Edward's formal coronation. To contemporary observers, it seemed a reasonable precaution during uncertain times. Within the Tower's royal apartments, the brothers settled into a routine that must have seemed like an extended holiday. They had their tutors, their servants, and each other's company. The Tower's gardens provided space for exercise and games, while the royal chambers offered comfort that few children in 15th century England could imagine. Tapestries depicted heroic tales of knights and kings, while fires kept the rooms warm against London's dampness. But even as the boys played, the political landscape around them shifted with dangerous speed. Questions arose about the legitimacy of their parents' marriage, suggesting that Edward IV's children might be bastards with no claim to the throne. These whispers, whether based in truth or manufactured for political convenience, provided Richard of Gloucester with the legal justification he needed to claim the crown for himself. Parliament, presented with evidence of the marriage's supposed invalidity, declared the princes illegitimate and offered the throne to Richard. On July 6, 1483, he was crowned Richard III in Westminster Abbey. While his nephews remained in the Tower, their status transformed overnight from royal heirs to royal prisoners. The coronation that had been planned for young Edward was transferred to his uncle, sealing the boy's fate in ways that contemporary observers could only guess at. As summer progressed, the princes were seen less frequently in the Tower's gardens and courtyards. Servants who had attended them reported that their movements had become restricted, though whether this was for their own protection or to prevent them from becoming focal points for rebellion remained unclear. The boys, too young to fully understand the political forces at work around them, continued their lessons and games, perhaps hoping that their uncle would soon resolve whatever complications had delayed Edward's coronation. By late August 1483, sightings of the princes had become rare. Guards spoke in whispers of orders they couldn't discuss, while servants found their access to the royal apartments increasingly limited. The Tower, which had buzzed with activity during the boys' early weeks there, began to take on the oppressive quiet that marked it as a place of secrets and shadows. The last reliable sighting of the princes came in early September, when a servant reported seeing them at a window of the Bloody Tower, looking out over the Thames with expressions that seemed older than their years. After that, they simply vanished from the historical record as completely as if the tower's stones had swallowed them whole. The silence surrounding their disappearance was profound and immediate. No official announcements explained their absence, no funeral rites marked their passing, and no graves were established where loyal subjects might pay their respects. They had simply ceased to exist in any public sense, becoming ghosts before their deaths could even be confirmed. Richard III's reign, which had begun with such promise and legitimacy, found itself shadowed by questions about his nephew's fate. Rumours spread through London's streets and travelled to courts across Europe, each more disturbing than the last. Some claimed the boys had been murdered on their uncle's orders, while others suggested they had been spirited away to safety by loyal supporters. The truth remained locked within the tower's walls, protected by the same stone silence that had guarded royal secrets for centuries. When Henry Tudor landed in Wales in 1485, challenging Richard III's claim to the throne, one of his most powerful. Weapons was the mystery surrounding the princes. Without living proof that his nephews were safe, Richard could not fully counter accusations that he had ordered their deaths. The missing boys became symbols of his alleged tyranny, rallying opposition to his rule in ways that conventional military challenges might not have achieved. After Henry's victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field, where Richard III died fighting, for his crown, the new king made various attempts to discover what had happened to the princes, but the Tower's servants who might have known the truth had either died, disappeared, or learned the value of permanent silence. The stone walls that had witnessed their fate remained as mute as the day they were built. In 1674, nearly 2 centuries after the princes disappeared, workmen renovating the tower discovered a wooden box containing the skeletons of 2 children. Found buried beneath a staircase in the White Tower, the remains were approximately the right size and age to be the missing princes. King Charles II ordered them buried in Westminster Abbey with ceremony appropriate for royal heirs, though no definitive identification could be made with the scientific methods available at the time. Modern forensic techniques have been applied to the Westminster Abbey remains, but the results remain inconclusive. The bones show signs of being roughly the right age and sex, but centuries of burial have degraded them beyond the point where absolute identification is possible. DNA analysis has been attempted, but has failed to produce definitive results, leaving the mystery as profound today as it was in 1483. The prince's disappearance has inspired countless theories, each attempting to solve a puzzle that may have no solution. Some historians argue that Richard III ordered their deaths as the only way to secure his throne against future rebellion. Others suggest that Henry Tudor was responsible, eliminating potential rivals after his own coronation. Still others propose that the boys were secretly removed from the tower and lived out their days in obscurity, their identities hidden to protect them from the dangerous politics of royal succession. Chapter 6. The Mary Celeste. On December 4th, 1872, the brigantine Dei Gratia cut through the cold Atlantic waters between Portugal and Gibraltar when her lookout spotted something that would become one of the sea's most enduring mysteries. Floating alone on the vast ocean, seemingly without purpose or direction, was another merchant vessel displaying no signals of distress, yet showing clear signs of abandonment. Captain David Morehouse of the Dei Gratia recognized the ship immediately as the Mary Celeste, commanded by his old friend Benjamin Briggs. The 2 captains had dined together just days before both vessels departed New York, discussing their planned routes and expected arrival times. Seeing Briggs's ship drifting unmanned filled Morehouse with a dread that no amount of seafaring experience could explain. The Mary Celeste had left New York on November 7th, 1872, carrying a cargo of denatured alcohol bound for Genoa. Her manifest listed 10 souls aboard: Captain Briggs, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and 7 experienced crew members. It was a routine voyage for a ship that had served the Atlantic trade routes faithfully for years, carrying her precious human cargo toward what should have been an unremarkable arrival in the Mediterranean. When boarding parties from the Dei Gratia climbed aboard the Mary Celeste, they found a vessel that seemed frozen in time. The ship was seaworthy, her cargo intact, and her lifeboat missing. But there were no signs of violence, no evidence of struggle, and no indication of what could have prompted 10 people to abandon a perfectly functional ship in the middle of the ocean. In the captain's cabin, personal belongings lay scattered as if their owners had stepped out momentarily and would return at any moment. Sarah Briggs' sewing basket sat open with thread and needles arranged as if she had been interrupted mid-stitch. Little Sophia's toys were arranged neatly in the family quarters, while her clothes hung ready for the next day's wear. The scene spoke of a family continuing their normal routines until some unknown event changed everything in an instant. The ship's log entries, written in Captain Briggs's careful hand, continued up until November 25th, 9 days before the Dei Gratia's discovery. The final entry noted their position as approximately 100 miles west of Portugal, with weather conditions described as strong winds, but nothing that would trouble an experienced crew. Whatever happened to the Mary Celeste's occupants occurred after that final log entry, leaving no written record of the events that prompted their departure. In the galley, breakfast preparations had been abandoned mid-process. Bread dough sat rising in covered bowls, while coffee remained in cups, as if the cook had been called away suddenly. The ship's cat, which normally would have been found somewhere aboard, was nowhere to be seen, perhaps taken by the crew as they departed, or perhaps lost overboard in whatever chaos had prompted their abandonment of the vessel. The cargo hold revealed its own mysteries. 9 of the 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol remained intact and properly secured, but one had been opened and found empty. Whether this barrel had leaked, been deliberately opened, or played some role in the crew's disappearance became a subject of intense speculation. The alcohol itself was poisonous if consumed, but experienced sailors would have known this and avoided drinking it. Navigation instruments lay scattered about the chart room in positions that suggested hasty packing or sudden departure. The ship's chronometer and sextant were missing, along with the vessel's papers and documentation. This indicated that whoever left the Mary Celeste had time to gather essential navigation tools, suggesting their departure was deliberate rather than panicked. The missing lifeboat left investigators with perhaps the most significant clue about the crew's fate. Unlike a ship's boat lost in heavy weather, this one had been deliberately launched, with davits properly rigged and tackle properly stowed. This professional seamanship in the boat's launching suggested that Captain Briggs had ordered an organized abandonment of his vessel, though what could have prompted such a drastic decision remained incomprehensible. Weather records from this period showed that while conditions had been rough, they were nothing extraordinary for North Atlantic navigation in late November. The Mary Celeste had weathered far worse storms during her years of service, and Captain Briggs was known as a capable seaman who would not abandon his ship lightly. Whatever threat he perceived must have seemed immediate and overwhelming to justify leaving a seaworthy vessel. Investigation of the ship's hull revealed no damage that would explain the abandonment. The Mary Celeste was taking on some water, as most wooden ships of her era did, but nothing approaching dangerous levels. Her sails were set for steady progress, though some had been damaged by weather after the crew's departure. The vessel was entirely capable of continuing her voyage to Genoa if anyone had remained aboard to sail her. The mystery deepened when authorities began interviewing crew members and passengers from other ships that had been in the same general area during late November. No one reported seeing signals of distress from the Mary Celeste, nor had anyone encountered her missing lifeboat or any survivors. 10 people had simply vanished from the face of the ocean without leaving any trace of their final moments. Theories about the crew's fate ranged from the plausible to the fantastic. Some suggested that fumes from the alcohol cargo had created an explosion risk that prompted evacuation, though no evidence of fire or explosion was found aboard the ship. Others proposed that a waterspout or sudden weather event had damaged the lifeboat after the crew abandoned ship, sending all 10 souls to the bottom of the Atlantic. More sinister theories suggested mutiny or piracy, though the lack of violence aboard the ship and the absence of any obvious motive made these explanations problematic. Captain Briggs was known for his fair treatment of crew members, and the cargo of denatured alcohol would have had little value to pirates. The family's presence aboard also argued against crew uprising. as experienced sailors would be unlikely to harm a captain's wife and child. The possibility of insurance fraud was investigated but quickly dismissed. Briggs had a substantial financial interest in both the ship and cargo, and stood to lose considerably more by their abandonment than he could gain through any fraudulent scheme. His reputation as an honest merchant captain also weighed against any suggestion of deliberate deception. As months passed without any discovery of the missing lifeboat or its occupants, the Mary Celeste case became a symbol of the ocean's ability to keep its secrets. The vast Atlantic, which had revealed countless shipwrecks to later generations, maintained perfect silence about the fate of 10 people who had simply vanished while their ships sailed on without them. The mystery became embedded in maritime folklore, inspiring countless theories, but yielding no definitive answers. The abandoned vessel herself continued to accumulate mystery even after her discovery. Sold at salvage auction, she passed through various owners before finally being deliberately wrecked off Haiti in 1885 as part of an insurance fraud scheme. Even in destruction, the Mary Celeste seemed to carry her secrets with her, as if the ship herself had become a keeper of the very mystery that made her famous. Modern maritime experts have applied contemporary knowledge of weather patterns, ocean, currents, and ship behavior to the Mary Celeste mystery, but the essential questions remain unanswered. Advanced search techniques have failed to locate any trace of the missing lifeboat or its occupants, while computer modeling of probable drift patterns has only expanded the possible search area to impossible proportions. The human element of the mystery, a family pursuing their normal routines aboard a merchant vessel before vanishing completely, continues to resonate with modern audiences. Sarah Briggs's unfinished sewing, little Sophia's toys arranged for play, and Captain Briggs's careful log entries create an intimate portrait of lives interrupted by forces that remain beyond our understanding. Their disappearance reminds us that, even in our age of global communication and satellite tracking, the ocean retains its power to swallow human stories without explanation. The Mary Celeste stands as perhaps the perfect maritime mystery, a ghost ship that revealed nothing while hiding everything, a puzzle that grows more intriguing with each failed attempt at solution. In the vast library of human mysteries, her empty decks and silent rigging represent the ocean's ultimate power, not merely to claim lives, but to claim them so completely that even their manner of passing becomes a secret that will never be revealed. Even as the rescue efforts continued, stories began to emerge that would only deepen the mystery surrounding Amelia Earhart's disappearance. Radio operators across the Pacific reported hearing fragmentary transmissions in the days following her vanishing, broken voices calling for help, coordinates that led nowhere, desperate pleas that faded into static. Some claimed to have heard a woman's voice saying she was down but alive, that the plane was partially submerged, that time was running out. The messages came sporadically, then ceased entirely, leaving behind only the endless whisper of ocean waves and the haunting possibility that rescue had been just beyond reach. The search for Amelia expanded into one of the most extensive rescue operations in aviation history, covering over 250,000 square miles of Pacific Ocean. Ships and planes crisscrossed the vast blue expanse, their crews scanning the waters for any sign of the silver Lockheed Electra or its remarkable pilot. But the Pacific kept its secrets, offering only false hopes, floating debris that proved to be nothing, radio signals that led to empty coordinates, and the constant mocking dance of sunlight on endless waves. With each passing day, the silence grew heavier, more profound, until it seemed to swallow not just Amelia Earhart, but the very possibility of answers. Theories bloomed like night flowers in the darkness of uncertainty. Some whispered that Amelia had been captured by Japanese forces, that her round-the-world flight had been a cover for intelligence gathering, that she had vanished into the shadowy world of international espionage. Others believed she had crashed on a remote Pacific island, surviving for days or weeks before succumbing to the elements or the slow passage of time. Still others imagined more fantastic scenarios, that she had been rescued by island natives, that she had assumed a new identity, that somewhere in the vast Pacific she had found a different kind of life entirely. The mystery of Amelia Earhart became more than just an unsolved disappearance. It became a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest fears and greatest hopes. In her vanishing, people saw their own mortality, their own dreams of transcendence, their own desire to push beyond the boundaries of the known world. She had flown into the infinite blue, seeking to circle the globe, and instead had become eternal, her story unbound by the simple facts of life and death, forever suspended in the realm of possibility and wonder. Chapter 8. The Vanishing of the Mary Celeste. If the skies had claimed Amelia Earhart, then the seas had long before swallowed an even stranger mystery, one that began on a December morning in 1872, when the merchant brigantine Dei Gratia spotted another vessel drifting listlessly between Portugal and the Azores. The ship appeared to be in distress, its sails partially set but moving without purpose through the grey Atlantic waters. As the Dei Gratia drew closer, her crew could see that the vessel was the Mary Celeste, a cargo ship they recognized from New York Harbor. But something was profoundly wrong. No one answered their hails, no figures moved on deck, and the ship seemed to drift like a phantom through the winter sea. Captain David Morehouse of the Dei Gratia sent a boarding party across the choppy waters to investigate. What they found aboard the Mary Celeste would become one of maritime history's most enduring puzzles. The ship was seaworthy, her cargo of denatured alcohol largely intact, her holds dry. Personal belongings remained undisturbed in the cabins. Clothes, folded neatly, a child's toys arranged carefully, a sewing machine with thread still in the needle. The ship's papers were missing, along with the lifeboat, but everything else suggested that the crew had simply vanished mid-task, as if they had been plucked from the deck by invisible hands. The Mary Celeste told a story that made no sense. The last entry in the ship's log was dated 10 days earlier, when Captain Benjamin Briggs had noted their position near the Azores. The cargo was valuable but undisturbed, ruling out piracy. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no evidence of struggle or conflict. Food and water supplies remained sufficient for weeks of sailing. The ship's cat was gone, along with the navigation instruments and the lifeboat, suggesting that the crew had abandoned ship voluntarily. But why would 10 experienced sailors abandon a seaworthy vessel in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? Theories multiplied like barnacles on a ship's hull. Some suggested that fumes from the alcohol cargo had created an explosion risk, forcing the crew to temporarily abandon ship, only to be unable to return when weather turned against them. Others believed that a waterspout or seismic activity had created panic, leading to a hasty evacuation. More sinister theories proposed mutiny, murder, or even supernatural intervention. The alcohol cargo spawned tales of drunken violence, though the barrels remained sealed and untapped. Some claimed the ship had encountered pirates or hostile vessels, but no other ships had been reported in the area. Captain Benjamin Briggs had been an experienced mariner, respected and reliable, traveling with his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia. The crew consisted of seasoned sailors, men who had weathered Atlantic storms and knew the difference between manageable danger and mortal threat. For such a group to abandon a sound ship suggested either extraordinary circumstances or extraordinary terror. The presence of Briggs's family added another layer of mystery. Would a father abandon a seaworthy vessel with his wife and infant child unless faced with immediate, overwhelming danger? The legal proceedings that followed the discovery only deepened the mystery. In Gibraltar, a maritime court convened to determine what had happened and who should receive salvage rights to the abandoned vessel. The testimony revealed the strange details that made the Mary Celeste case so compelling. The captain's bed was unmade but neat, as if he had just risen. The galley showed signs of recent meal preparation. The ship's compass was destroyed, though. Whether by accident or design remained unclear. Most puzzling of all, the ship's pumps were in working order, and there was no more water in the holds than normal for a vessel of her age. Frederick Solly Flood, Gibraltar's Attorney General, suspected foul play and fraud, believing that the crews of both ships had conspired to share the salvage money. His investigation turned up inconsistencies and suspicious details, but no evidence of actual wrongdoing. The more he probed, the more the mystery seemed to deepen. If the case was fraud, it was remarkably elaborate and well executed. If it was genuine, then something had happened aboard the Mary Celeste that defied rational explanation. Something that had compelled an entire crew to flee a perfectly sound ship and vanish without trace into the vast Atlantic. As news of the Mary Celeste spread, the story grew in the telling. Writers and journalists embellished the details, adding elements that had never existed. Warm meals still on the table, pipes still smouldering, clocks still ticking. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a fictionalized account that introduced ideas of supernatural intervention and mysterious forces. The line between fact and fiction blurred until the Mary Celeste became less a historical incident than a maritime legend. A ghost ship sailing eternally through the collective imagination. The real Mary Celeste met a mundane end years later, deliberately wrecked in the Caribbean as part of an insurance fraud scheme. But the mystery of what happened to Captain Briggs, his family, and his crew remained unsolved. They had vanished as completely as if they had sailed off the edge of the world, leaving behind only an empty ship and endless questions. The Atlantic Ocean, which had swallowed so many vessels and souls throughout history, had claimed not just lives, but truth itself, transforming a simple shipping voyage into one of history's most enduring enigmas. Deep in the heart of the Amazon, rainforest, where the green canopy stretches endlessly toward misty horizons and ancient rivers carry secrets older than memory, Colonel Percy Fawcett believed he had found traces of a civilization that would rewrite history. It was the early 20th century, and the Amazon was still largely unmapped, a vast green mystery where indigenous tribes lived as they had for centuries, and where European explorers died in terrible solitude, consumed by fever, starvation, or the inexorable embrace of the jungle itself. Into this verdant labyrinth, Fawcett carried maps, instruments, and an obsession that would ultimately consume his life. Fawcett was not a romantic dreamer, but a methodical British surveyor, a man who had spent years mapping the borders between Bolivia, Peru, and Brazil for the Royal Geographical Society. He had survived snake bites, attacks by indigenous warriors, and tropical diseases that had killed stronger men. But by 1925, his attention had turned from surveying existing territories to discovering something far more extraordinary. A lost city he called Zede, which he believed represented the remnants of an advanced civilization that had once flourished in the Amazon basin. The inspiration for Fawcett's quest came from multiple sources, each feeding his growing conviction that the Amazon held secrets beyond European imagination. Indigenous stories spoke of great cities with stone temples and vast populations, civilizations that had existed before the conquistadors arrived to find only scattered tribes and endless forest. Portuguese documents from the colonial period described expeditions that had encountered sophisticated settlements deep in the interior, places with roads, bridges, and architecture that rivaled anything in Europe. Most intriguingly, Fawcett had obtained a copy of an 18th century manuscript that described a Portuguese bandeirante expedition that had discovered a ruined city of immense proportions somewhere in the Mato Grosso region. The manuscript, known as Document 512, painted a picture of crumbling grandeur hidden beneath centuries of jungle growth. It described massive stone structures, hieroglyphic inscriptions, and evidence of a civilization that had mastered engineering, astronomy, and urban planning. The Portuguese explorers who had allegedly discovered this city reported finding gold and silver artifacts, chambers filled with treasure, and inscriptions in an unknown script. They had been forced to flee when their guides abandoned them, and the location of the city had been lost when the expedition members died before they could return to civilization. Fawcett believed that this lost city, his Z, represented proof that advanced civilizations had existed in the Americas long before European contact. Civilizations that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored by historians who could not conceive of non-European achievement. He theorized that Z might be connected to Atlantis or other legendary civilizations, that it might represent a branch of human development that had taken a completely different path from European culture. The Amazon, he argued, was not an empty wilderness, but a region that had once supported millions of people in sophisticated urban centers. In 1925, Fawcett embarked on his final expedition to find Z, accompanied by his eldest son, Jack, and Jack's friend, Raleigh Reimel. The three men disappeared into the Amazon and were never seen again. Their last communication was a message sent from Dead Horse Camp, a location that Fawcett had named during a previous expedition. In that final note, he reported that they were about to enter unexplored territory and expressed optimism about their chances of success. Then silence fell like a curtain, absolute and enduring. The disappearance of Percy Fawcett became one of the 20th century's most famous mysteries, sparking dozens of rescue expeditions and inspiring countless theories about what had happened to the three explorers. Some believed they had been killed by hostile indigenous tribes who were defending their territory from intruders. Others suggested that they had succumbed to disease, starvation, or the countless natural hazards of the Amazon. More romantic, theories proposed that they had found Z and chosen to remain there, becoming part of the civilization they had sought to discover. Over the years, various expeditions claimed to have found evidence of Fawcett's fate. Some reported discovering his belongings among indigenous tribes. Others claimed to have found his remains, and still others insisted they had seen him alive, living as a captive or as an honored guest among remote populations. But none of these claims could be verified, and the jungle kept its secrets. The Amazon had swallowed Fawcett as completely as it had swallowed countless other explorers, leaving behind only stories and speculation. Ironically, modern archaeology has begun to vindicate some of Fawcett's theories about ancient Amazonian civilizations. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have revealed evidence of extensive earthworks, raised fields, and complex settlements throughout the Amazon basin. These discoveries suggest that the region once supported much larger populations than previously believed, with sophisticated agricultural systems and urban centers that were abandoned and reclaimed by the jungle centuries before European arrival. Fawcett may have been right about the existence of advanced civilizations in the Amazon, even if he never found his city of Z. The legend of Z has become inseparable from the legend of Fawcett himself, a man whose obsession with discovery led him into the heart of one of Earth's most forbidding environments. His story represents the eternal human drive to explore the unknown, to push beyond the boundaries of the mapped world in search of something magnificent and transformative. In the green depths of the Amazon, where ancient trees tower like cathedrals and rivers flow like arteries through the body of the earth, Fawcett's ghost still searches for his lost city, forever pursuing a dream that may have been more real than anyone imagined. In the spring of 1900, a team of Greek sponge divers seeking shelter from a storm anchored their boat near the tiny island of Antikythera, which lay between Crete and the Greek mainland, like a forgotten stepping stone across the wine-dark Aegean Sea. What began as a simple quest for sponges became one of archaeology's most extraordinary discoveries when diver Elias Stadiatis descended into the clear Mediterranean waters and found himself face to face with the ghostly remnants of an ancient shipwreck. Bronze arms reached up from the seafloor, marble faces stared sightlessly through the blue water, and scattered across the sandy bottom lay the cargo of a vessel that had sunk more than 2,000 years earlier. The wreck dated to approximately 70-60 BCE, during the twilight years of the Roman Republic, when merchants and scholars moved freely across the Mediterranean, carrying treasures of art, philosophy, and science between the great cities of the ancient world. The ship had been carrying a magnificent cargo: bronze and marble statues, amphoras filled with wine and oil, gold jewelry, and glass vessels of exquisite craftsmanship. But among these treasures lay something far more mysterious: a corroded bronze mechanism that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about ancient technology. At first glance, the device appeared to be nothing more than a lump of corroded bronze, its surface green with verdigris and encrusted with marine growth from centuries beneath the sea. It might have been dismissed as an unremarkable artifact, perhaps a decorative element from one of the statues, had it not been for the careful eye of archaeologist Valerios Stais. When the mechanism was cleaned and examined more closely, intricate gears and inscriptions became visible beneath the corrosion. This was not decoration, but machinery, complex, sophisticated machinery that seemed impossibly advanced for its time. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be known, consisted of at least 37 bronze gears arranged in a complex system of interlocking wheels and dials. The device was housed in a wooden box about the size of a large book with bronze plates on, the front and back covered in detailed astronomical and calendrical inscriptions in ancient Greek. As researchers painstakingly studied the mechanism using increasingly advanced techniques, X-rays, CT scans, and computer modeling, they began to understand that they were looking at what might be called the world's first analog computer. The mechanism was designed to predict the positions of the sun, moon, and planets with remarkable accuracy. By turning a hand crank, an operator could model the movement of celestial bodies years into the future or past. The device could predict solar and lunar eclipses, track the phases of the moon, and follow the complex cycles of the planets as they wandered across the night sky. It incorporated sophisticated astronomical knowledge, including the elliptical orbit of the moon and the variable speed of the sun's apparent motion through the zodiac, concepts that European astronomers would not rediscover until the time of Kepler in the 17th century. The existence of such a device in the 1st century BCE suggested that ancient Greek mechanical engineering and astronomical knowledge were far more advanced than historians had believed. The level of precision required to cut the gears, the mathematical sophistication needed to design the gear ratios, and the astronomical observations necessary to program the device all pointed to a tradition of scientific instrument making that had been completely lost to history. This was not primitive technology, but a sophisticated calculating machine that would not be surpassed in complexity until the development of mechanical clocks in medieval Europe. But who had created this remarkable device and why? The mechanism's inscriptions provided some clues, mentioning astronomical phenomena and calendar cycles, but they did not identify the maker or the intended user. Some scholars suggested it might have been created in Rhodes, where the astronomer Hipparchus had made important discoveries about the motion of celestial bodies. Others pointed to Alexandria, with its great library and tradition of mechanical innovation. The device might have been a teaching tool for students of astronomy, a practical calculator for astrologers, or a prestigious demonstration of Greek scientific achievement. The mystery deepened when researchers realized that the Antikythera mechanism was probably not unique. Ancient texts mentioned similar devices created by famous inventors and astronomers, suggesting that such instruments were known in antiquity, even if no other examples had survived. Cicero wrote of mechanical spheres created by Archimedes that could demonstrate the motions of the sun, moon, and planets. Posidonius was said to have constructed a device that showed the movement of celestial bodies. If such machines existed, what happened to the tradition of their creation? Why did this knowledge disappear so completely that the Antikythera mechanism seemed impossible when it was first discovered? The answer may lie in the broader collapse of the classical world and the loss of scientific and technical knowledge that accompanied the fall of the Roman Empire. Libraries were destroyed, workshops abandoned, and the complex trade networks that had supported specialized craftsmanship were disrupted by war and economic decline. The knowledge needed to create devices like the Antikythera mechanism may have been possessed by only a few specialists, making it vulnerable to disappearance when those individuals died, or when the institutions that supported them collapsed. Today, the Antikythera mechanism stands as a bronze testament to the sophistication of ancient science and the fragility of human knowledge. It reminds us that technological progress is not always linear, that civilizations can possess capabilities that are later lost and forgotten. In its corroded gears and faded inscriptions, we glimpse a world where Greek astronomers used mechanical computers to map the heavens, where science and craftsmanship combined to create instruments of breathtaking complexity and beauty. The mechanism continues to yield secrets as new analytical techniques reveal details that were invisible to earlier researchers. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of ancient Greek science and engineering, but also raises new questions about what other marvels may have existed in the classical world. The device serves as a humbling reminder that our ancestors were capable of achievements that we are only beginning to understand, and that the past may hold technologies and insights that could still surprise and inspire us today. In the hushed halls of Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, surrounded by some of humanity's most precious written treasures, sits a volume that has confounded scholars for over a century. The Voynich manuscript, as it has come to be known, appears to be a medieval text filled with botanical drawings, astronomical diagrams, and what seem to be recipes or instructions. But every word is written in a script that no one can read, every page filled with symbols that follow no known linguistic pattern. Every illustration depicting plants and concepts that appear to exist nowhere else on Earth. The manuscript takes its name from Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish book dealer who acquired it in 1912 from the Jesuit college at the Villa Mondragone near Rome. But the book's history stretches back much further, shrouded in the same mystery that surrounds its contents. Carbon dating has placed its creation in the early 15th century, during the height of the Renaissance, when scholars and scientists were rediscovering classical knowledge and pushing the boundaries of human understanding. Yet, this book seems to come from an entirely different tradition of learning, one that used different symbols, different concepts, and different ways of organizing knowledge. The The manuscript consists of approximately 240 vellum pages, though it appears that additional pages have been lost over the centuries. The text is written in an unknown script using an alphabet of roughly 20-25 characters that appear nowhere else in the historical record. The characters flow in lines from left to right, forming what appear to be words and sentences, but they follow patterns that seem to defy linguistic analysis. Some characters appear frequently, others rarely, and the distribution of letters follows statistical patterns that are unlike any known language. What makes the Voynich manuscript particularly mysterious are its illustrations, which occupy much of the book and seem to depict knowledge from multiple fields of study. The botanical section shows detailed drawings of plants, but they are plants that botanists cannot identify. Some appear to be composite creations, combining elements from different real plants in impossible ways. Others seem to be entirely imaginary, with root systems, leaves, and flowers that follow no known botanical principles. The astronomical section contains circular diagrams with zodiacal symbols and star charts, but they do not correspond to any known astronomical traditions. Perhaps most intriguing are the pages that show naked women bathing in elaborate systems of pipes and pools, connected by a network of tubes and containers that might represent some form of hydraulic or alchemical apparatus. These images have been interpreted as everything from medical treatments to mystical rituals, but their true meaning remains as opaque as the text that accompanies them. The women appear healthy and content, engaged in activities that seem both mundane and mysterious, as if the manuscript is documenting practices that were familiar to its original readers, but incomprehensible to us. Attempts to decode the Voynich manuscript have attracted some of history's most skilled codebreakers and linguists. During World War II, cryptographers who were successfully breaking enemy codes tried their hand at the manuscript, only to be defeated by its alien logic. Computer scientists have applied statistical analysis, pattern recognition, and artificial intelligence to the problem, but the text continues to resist interpretation. Some researchers have claimed breakthroughs, announcing that they have identified the language or cracked the code, but none of these claims have withstood scrutiny. The manuscript's resistance to decoding has led to various theories about its nature and origin. Some scholars believe it represents a constructed language or cipher created by medieval scientists or mystics to protect their secrets from unauthorized readers. Others suggest it might be a work of medieval science fiction, an imaginative creation that was never intended to convey real information. More exotic theories propose that it represents knowledge from a lost civilization, communication from extraterrestrial visitors, or even an elaborate hoax designed to confound future generations. One particularly intriguing theory suggests that the manuscript might be written in a natural language that has since become extinct, perhaps the vocabulary of a small medieval community that developed its own unique dialect and writing system. This would explain why the text follows some linguistic patterns while remaining incomprehensible. It might be as foreign to us as any dead language, but with no surviving speakers or related texts to provide a key to its meaning. The possibility that the Voynich manuscript is an elaborate hoax cannot be dismissed entirely, though it would require a level of sophistication that seems unlikely for a medieval forger. The consistency of the script throughout the manuscript, the realistic aging of the vellum and inks, and the complex internal structure of the text all suggest that if it is a fake, it was created by someone with extraordinary skill and patience. Moreover, the carbon dating confirms that the manuscript is genuinely medieval, not a modern creation. Recent analysis using advanced imaging techniques has revealed hidden details in the manuscript's illustrations and text, including corrections, additions, and layers of meaning that were invisible to earlier researchers. These discoveries suggest that the manuscript was a working document, revised and updated over time, rather than a static creation. This implies that it represented living knowledge, ideas that were being developed and refined by its creators. The Voynich manuscript remains one of history's most tantalizing puzzles, a book that seems to contain knowledge while simultaneously withholding it. In its mysterious pages, we encounter the limits of human understanding, the possibility that there are forms of knowledge and expression that lie forever beyond our reach. The manuscript sits in its climate-controlled case like a silent oracle, holding secrets that may be profound or trivial, revolutionary or nonsensical, but which continue to elude our most sophisticated attempts at understanding. Perhaps the true mystery of the Voynich manuscript lies not in what it says, but in what it represents. The human drive to encode knowledge, to create meaning, and to communicate across the barriers of time and understanding. In its indecipherable script and impossible plants, we see reflected our own limitations and our endless hunger to know what cannot be known, to solve what may be fundamentally unsolvable. As night falls over the manuscript's current home, and the reading room grows quiet, the ancient pages continue their silent testimony to human ingenuity and mystery. Tomorrow will bring new researchers, new theories, new attempts to crack the code that has resisted solution for centuries. But tonight, the Voynich manuscript keeps its secrets. A reminder that some mysteries may be more valuable unsolved than solved. More beautiful in their inscrutability than they could ever be in revelation. Dreams and shadows, where they walk hand in hand with those who search for them across the centuries. Their voices carrying on winds that remember when the world was younger, when mysteries were born from wonder rather than investigation, when the unknown held magic instead of merely puzzles to be solved. In the mists of northern Britain, where Hadrian's Wall would one day stand as Rome's final frontier, 5,000 men marched into legend and never returned. The 9th Legion, proud bearers of eagles won in battles across the empire, disappeared into the Scottish Highlands like smoke dissolving into morning air. Their bronze standards that had glinted in Mediterranean sunlight now caught the pale gleam of Celtic skies. Their leather and steel growing heavy with Highland dew as they advanced into territories where Roman roads ended and ancient ways began. They had conquered from Spain to the banks of the Rhine, these sons of Rome whose fathers had fought under Caesar's banners. The Hispana, as they were known, carried with them the weight of imperial pride and the certainty that Roman discipline could overcome any barbarian resistance. But in the rolling hills and dark forests beyond the River Forth, certainty became question, and question became silence. The archaeological record speaks in whispers. At Nijmegen, their base along the Rhine, the 9th Legion's presence simply ends, like a song cut short mid-verse. No burial grounds mark their passing. No monument records their sacrifice. The official histories grow vague, mentioning transfers to the east that leave no paper trail, suggesting disasters too shameful for imperial record-keeping. But in the northern territories of Britain, no trace of their final stand has ever been found. Perhaps they encountered the Caledonians, those painted warriors who knew every hidden path and secret valley, who could appear from mist-like spirits and vanish just as completely. Perhaps the legionaries, accustomed to fighting in formation on open ground, found themselves lost in forests where shadows moved with purpose, and the very landscape seemed alive with hostile intent. Or perhaps something far more mysterious claimed them, some ancient power that slept beneath Scottish soil until Roman hobnails and Celtic defiance awakened it. The theories multiply like ripples on dark water, Some scholars suggest disease swept through their ranks as they camped beside unknown streams. Others propose that the entire legion was overwhelmed not in battle, but by the gradual realization that they had marched beyond the edge of their known, whirled into a realm where Roman eagles held no sway. The silence that followed their passage speaks of something more profound than military defeat. It suggests a transformation, as if 5,000 men simply stepped across an invisible threshold and became part of the mystery they had encountered. In the centuries that followed, local legends arose like flowers from unmarked graves. Highland folk spoke of ghostly columns seen marching through mountain passes on moonless nights, their spectral standards bearing emblems worn smooth by time and weather. Shepherds reported finding ancient coins in places where no Roman foot should have tread, as if the legion had scattered its pay as offerings to gods whose names they never learned. The mystery deepened with each archaeological expedition that failed to locate their remains. Modern metal detectors sweep across Scottish hillsides, seeking the telltale signs of Roman presence, the belt buckles, spear points, and ceramic shards that mark the passage of imperial armies. But the Ninth Legion left no such traces, as if they had been absorbed into the very earth they sought to conquer. Perhaps the truth lies not in military records or archaeological evidence, but in the nature of boundaries themselves. The Ninth Legion marched to the edge of the Roman world, to a place where civilization met something older and more enduring. In crossing that threshold, they may have discovered that some territories cannot be conquered, only joined. Their disappearance becomes not a military defeat, but a transformation, a passage from history into legend, from the recorded world into the realm of eternal questions. On a summer day in 1590, John White returned to the shores of what would become North Carolina, his heart heavy with 3 years of separation from his daughter and granddaughter. The settlement he had left behind on Roanoke Island should have buzzed with the activity of 115 colonists, building new lives in the new world. Instead, he found only silence and the single word, Croatoan, carved into a wooden post, as if the entire community had distilled their fate into 5 letters that raised more questions than they answered. The story had begun with such hope, such careful planning. Unlike the rough adventurers who often crossed the Atlantic seeking quick fortune, these colonists included families, craftsmen, and farmers, people committed to building rather than merely exploiting. Eleanor Dare, White's daughter, had given birth to Virginia Dare just days after their arrival, the first English child born in the Americas. The baby's cry had seemed to herald a new chapter in human expansion, a bridge between old world and new. But when supply ships had been delayed by war with Spain, the infant colony found itself suspended between 2 worlds, too new to be self-sufficient, too isolated to call for help. White's enforced absence stretched from months into years as English resources focused on defending against the Spanish Armada. By the time he could return, the Atlantic had swallowed whatever fate had befallen, his family and friends. The settlement itself bore no signs of violence or hurried departure. Houses had been carefully dismantled, their timbers organized as if the colonists had planned their relocation with the same methodical approach they had used in construction. Personal belongings of value had vanished, but heavier items remained, suggesting a deliberate rather than desperate evacuation. Most mysteriously, the palisade around the settlement remained intact, its gates closed, as if to keep something out, or in. The word Croatoan pointed toward a nearby island inhabited by friendly Algonquian peoples who had traded peacefully with earlier English expeditions. But when White attempted to sail there, storms and contrary winds drove his ship away from the coast, as if the ocean itself conspired to preserve the mystery. He would never learn whether his family lived among the Croatoan or had met some darker fate. In the centuries that followed, the lost colonists became a haunting presence in American folklore. Explorers and settlers reported encounters with blue-eyed, fair-haired indigenous people who spoke fragments of English and carried tools of European manufacture. These accounts, filtered through layers of hope and prejudice, suggested that at least some colonists had survived by joining local communities, their descendants carrying European genes into bloodlines that stretched back millennia on the American continent. Archaeological investigations have yielded tantalizing hints, but no definitive answers. Artifacts discovered on Hatteras Island, the location of the historical Croatoan settlement, include European-style objects that could date to the late 16th century. Ring fragments, copper farthings, and iron tools speak of cultural exchange and adaptation, of people learning to survive in a landscape vastly different from the England they had left behind. Yet for every clue that emerges from the sandy soil of the Outer Banks, more questions arise. Did the colonists integrate peacefully with local communities, their children growing up as cultural bridges between European and American ways of life? Were they overcome by disease, harsh weather, or conflicts their records never documented? Or did they simply walk into the vast interior of the continent, seeking a more promising location for their settlement, and leaving behind only that single cryptic word as explanation? The mystery of Roanoke resonates because it captures something essential about the human experience of exploration and settlement. Every migration carries within it the risk of disappearance, the possibility that those who venture into unknown territories might themselves become unknown. The lost colonists remind us that history is shaped as much by those who vanish as by those who leave detailed records of their achievements. In quiet moments, when wind moves through the maritime forests of the Outer Banks, it seems possible to hear echoes of that lost community, the laughter of children playing in sandy clearings, the voices of adults negotiating between old customs and new necessities, the soft conversations of people adapting to a world that would reshape them. Even as they sought to shape it, their disappearance becomes not an ending, but a transformation, a passage into the deeper currents of American becoming. In the summer of 1518, the cobblestones of Strasbourg witnessed something that defied every category of human understanding. It began with a single woman, Frau Trophea, who stepped into the narrow street outside her home and began to dance. Not the graceful movements of celebration or the rhythmic steps of ceremony, but a wild, compulsive motion that seemed to possess her body against her will. Hour after hour she danced, her feet bleeding, her breath coming in ragged gasps, yet unable to stop the relentless movement that held her in its grip. Within days, others joined her, not by choice, but as if seized by the same invisible force that drove Frau Trophäa's tortured steps. Merchants abandoned their stalls, housewives left their kitchens, children forgot their games as the dancing spread through the city like a contagion of motion. By the end of the week, 34 people writhed and spun in the streets. Within a month, the number had swollen to 400 souls trapped in a dance they could not name and could not stop. The local authorities, faced with a phenomenon that challenged every assumption about human behavior, consulted physicians, priests, and scholars. The medical men spoke of hot blood and imbalanced humors, prescribing treatments that seemed pathetically inadequate against the supernatural frenzy consuming their patients. The clergy saw divine punishment for the city's sins, calling for prayers and penance while the dancers continued their macabre performance in the shadow of the cathedral. Most bewildering of all, the officials eventually decided that the cure for the dancing was more dancing. They hired musicians and professional dancers, constructing stages in guild halls and public squares where the afflicted could dance more safely. The logic seemed to be that the malady would exhaust itself if given proper outlet, like a fever that must burn itself out before it could break. But the dancing only intensified. The professional musicians found their melodies twisted into something darker, their rhythms becoming urgent and hypnotic in ways that seemed to reach beyond conscious hearing. Witnesses described music that felt alive, melodies that seemed to writhe and pulse with their own malevolent purpose. Some of the hired entertainers themselves became infected, their practiced steps transforming into the same desperate, uncontrolled movements that characterized the plague. The dancers themselves could offer no explanation for their condition. When exhaustion finally forced brief respites, they spoke of feeling compelled by forces beyond their control, of music that played inside their heads even in silence, of rhythms that seemed to emanate from the very stones beneath their feet. Some claimed to see visions as they danced, glimpses of other times and places where similar afflictions had struck, as if they had become part of a pattern that stretched across centuries. Historical records suggest that people died from the dancing plague, their hearts giving out under the relentless exertion, their bodies unable to sustain the supernatural demands placed upon them. Yet the exact number of fatalities remains unclear, as if the plague existed in a realm where ordinary accounting failed to apply. Church records from the period show gaps and inconsistencies, as if the scribes themselves had been affected by the strange atmosphere that enveloped the city. Modern theories attempt to rationalize the phenomenon. Some scholars suggest ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, pointing to the hallucinogenic properties of the fungus that could produce delusions and uncontrolled movement. Others propose mass hysteria triggered by social and economic stress, noting that the plague occurred during a period of famine and political uncertainty. Psychological explanations focus on the power of suggestion in closed communities, the way that unusual behavior can spread through populations like a virus of the mind. Yet none of these explanations fully captures the strangeness of what occurred. In Strasbourg, the dancing plague was not merely mass hysteria, but something more focused and purposeful, as if it served some function that observers could not understand. The dancers moved with a coordination that suggested hidden patterns, their seemingly random gyrations, occasionally forming shapes and configurations that witnesses found disturbing in ways they could not articulate. The plague ended as mysteriously as it had begun. The dancers were taken to a shrine outside the city, where prayers were offered for their recovery. Whether through divine intervention, the change of location, or simple exhaustion, the compulsive movements gradually ceased. The afflicted returned to their normal lives, though many reported lasting effects. Dreams filled with music, an occasional involuntary step that echoed the rhythm that had once consumed them, a sensitivity to certain sounds that could trigger brief returns of the dancing urge. In the years that followed, Strasbourg tried to forget the summer of the dancing plague, but the memory lingered like a tune that could not be entirely erased. Street musicians found certain rhythms discouraged by unspoken agreement, and public festivals avoided the specific combinations of sound and movement that might awaken whatever force had temporarily claimed the city's inhabitants. The dancing plague of 1518 remains one of history's most enigmatic mass events, a reminder that human consciousness contains depths that resist easy explanation. It suggests that beneath the surface of ordinary life lie currents of experience that can suddenly surge to the surface, transforming rational individuals into participants in dramas whose scripts are written in languages older than words. The dancers of Strasbourg had encountered something that spoke to parts of human nature that civilization has tried to forget, and for a brief, terrifying summer, they became its unwilling chorus. In the whitewashed chambers of the Tower of London, two young boys played their final games in the summer of 1483, unaware that their laughter would echo through centuries as one of history's most haunting mysteries. Edward V, the 12-year-old king who would never be crowned, and his 9-year-old brother Richard, Duke of York, had been placed in the tower ostensibly for their protection during the turbulent transition following their father's sudden death. But protection became prison, and prison became something darker still, as the boys simply vanished from history, like morning mist, touched by the first rays of an unforgiving sun. The story begins with the death of Edward IV, a king who had fought his way to the throne through the brutal Wars of the Roses, only to die unexpectedly at age 40, leaving a 12-year-old heir and a kingdom riddled with ambitious nobles. The boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, initially served as Lord Protector, shepherding his nephew toward coronation with what appeared to be proper familial duty. But beneath the surface of royal protocol, darker currents moved like shadows cast by torchlight on stone walls. Richard's claim that his brother's marriage had been invalid, rendering the young princes illegitimate, struck many contemporaries as convenient rather than credible. Canon law in the 15th century was complex enough to provide justification for almost any position if one searched hard enough and had sufficient political power to enforce the interpretation. The boys' removal to the tower, presented as a temporary measure for their safety, began to feel increasingly permanent as summer progressed toward autumn. Witnesses reported seeing the princes playing in the tower's gardens during the early weeks of their residency, their voices carrying across the ancient courtyards as they adapted to their constrained circumstances with the resilience of youth. They shot arrows in the practice yards, explored the maze of corridors and chambers that had housed prisoners and royalty for centuries, and maintained the routines of education and prayer that had structured their lives before their father's death. But gradually, the sightings ceased. Servants who had once freely accessed their quarters found doors locked. Guards who had grown familiar with the boys' schedules were reassigned to other duties. The tower, always a place of secrets, seemed to close around the princes like a stone, flower folding its petals against winter's approach. By autumn, even the most persistent inquiries met with vague responses and changed subjects. Richard III's coronation proceeded without the presence of his nephews, their absence explained by various official pronouncements that satisfied no one entirely. The new king's supporters spoke of the boys being moved to secure locations in the countryside, away from the political turbulence of London. But no letters arrived from these supposed retreats. No messengers brought word of their well-being, and no visits were permitted to concerned relatives. In the years that followed, rumours proliferated like weeds in untended gardens. Some claimed the princes had been smuggled out of the tower and lived under assumed identities in foreign courts. Others whispered of midnight murders, of small bodies buried beneath flagstones, or dropped into the Thames weighted with stones. The lack of concrete evidence allowed every theory to flourish, each more dramatic than the last. The discovery of children's skeletons beneath a tower staircase in 1674 seemed to provide confirmation of the prince's fate, but even this evidence raised more questions than it answered. The bones were examined by royal physicians and declared to be those of the missing boys, but the primitive forensic techniques of the 17th century could hardly provide definitive identification. The remains were interred in Westminster Abbey with royal ceremony, but doubts persisted about whether these were truly the princes or merely convenient symbols for a monarchy seeking to close an uncomfortable chapter of its history. Modern attempts to resolve the mystery through scientific analysis have been frustrated by the royal family's reluctance to permit DNA testing of the remains. The skeletons rest in their marble tomb, holding their secrets as closely as they held their royal blood, while historians continue to debate evidence that grows more ambiguous rather than clearer with each scholarly examination. The true mystery may lie not in the specific fate of Edward IV and Richard of York, but in the way their disappearance encapsulates the vulnerability of innocence in worlds shaped by adult ambition. These boys, born to the highest rank their society could offer, discovered that privileges could become prisons, and protectors could become threats with bewildering suddenness. Their story resonates across centuries because it speaks to fundamental fears about the safety of children in circumstances beyond their control. Perhaps the princes in the tower represent something larger than a historical puzzle, a reminder that even the most privileged lives can vanish without trace when they become inconvenient to those who wield power. Their mystery endures because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationship between innocence and authority, between the promises societies make to protect their most vulnerable members, and the reality of what happens when those promises conflict with political necessity. In the quiet corners of the Tower of London, where tourists now snap photographs and guides recite well-rehearsed stories, the absence of those two young voices still seems to linger. Their laughter has been replaced by the speculation of centuries, their games by the endless interpretations of historians and novelists, but in some deeper sense, they remain present, not as historical facts to be proven or disproven, but as eternal questions about the nature of power, protection, and the price of royal blood. As our journey through history's unsolved mysteries draws toward its close, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a vast ocean of questions that stretches beyond the horizon of human knowledge. Each vanishing we have explored, each disappearance we have contemplated, reveals something profound about the nature of existence itself, the way that even the most carefully documented lives can slip beyond the reach of certainty, becoming legends that speak to truths larger than facts. The Antikythera mechanism continues to tick in archaeological imagination, its bronze gears measuring astronomical cycles that ancient craftsmen understood in ways we can barely reconstruct. The dancing plague of Strasbourg reminds us that human consciousness contains depths that rational thought cannot fully plumb, territories where collective experience transcends individual will. The princes in the tower embody the vulnerability that haunts all power, the way that even royal blood can vanish without trace when it becomes inconvenient to those who shape history's official narratives. These mysteries persist not because they lack explanations, but because they touch something in human nature that needs questions more than answers. They remind us that the world contains spaces that resist complete understanding, territories where imagination and reality intersect in ways that logic cannot fully map. In contemplating these vanishings, we encounter not just historical puzzles, but reflections of our own deepest uncertainties about existence, identity, and the meaning of human experience. The lost civilizations we have explored, Atlantis with its perfect symmetry, the Indus Valley with its undeciphered script, the Anasazi with their sudden departure from carefully constructed homes, suggest that human societies are more fragile than we often acknowledge. They remind us that progress is not inevitable, that sophisticated cultures can vanish as completely as individuals, leaving behind only fragments that future generations struggle to interpret. Perhaps this fragility is not a flaw in human civilization, but an essential characteristic, a reminder that all achievements exist in constant dialogue with entropy and change. The mysteries we have explored suggest that permanence may be an illusion, that even the most monumental accomplishments are ultimately temporary arrangements of matter and energy that will eventually return to the cosmic processes that created them. The figures who have vanished from history, Amelia Earhart disappearing into Pacific immensity, the Ninth Legion marching beyond the edges of Roman knowledge, the colonists of Roanoke integrating so completely with their new environment that they became invisible to European eyes. embody the human tendency to push beyond known boundaries. Their disappearances mark not failures, but completions. The moment when exploration becomes transformation, when the seeker becomes one with what they seek. In this sense, every mystery contains its own resolution, not in the form of factual explanations, but in the way it expands our understanding of what it means to be human. The questions that surround these vanishings are not problems to be solved, but invitations to participate in the ongoing conversation between consciousness and cosmos, between individual experience and universal patterns. The artifacts that remain from these lost worlds, the crystal skulls with their impossible craftsmanship, the stone heads of Easter Island gazing eternally seaward, the megalithic constructions that seem to encode astronomical knowledge in rock and earth, serve as reminders that human creativity operates on scales that individual lifespans cannot encompass. They suggest that our ancestors understood time differently than we do, planning projects that would require generations to complete, and designing monuments to communicate with descendants they would never meet. This perspective on time as something larger than individual experience appears throughout the mysteries we have explored. The builders of Göbekli Tepe created temple complexes that served purposes we can no longer understand, then deliberately buried them as if their function had been completed in ways that transcended immediate utility. The mathematical precision of Stonehenge suggests planning that spans centuries, a coordinated effort that required continuous transmission of knowledge across multiple generations. These examples point toward an understanding of human purpose that extends beyond personal achievement to encompass participation in processes that operate on geological and astronomical timescales. The mysteries become invitations to consider our own lives as parts of patterns too large for individual comprehension, contributions to conversations that began before we were born and will continue long after we return to the elements that compose us. The vanishings we have contemplated also illuminate the relationship between individual consciousness and collective memory. Each disappearance represents not just the loss of specific people or knowledge, but a rupture in the continuity of human experience. Yet these ruptures paradoxically preserve what they interrupt, transforming historical facts into mythological truths that speak to universal rather than particular concerns. The mystery of the Mary Celeste becomes more than a maritime puzzle when we recognize it as a metaphor for the way consciousness itself seems to navigate between presence and absence, between engagement with the world and withdrawal into invisible depths. The abandoned ship, sailing perfectly toward an unknown destination with no one aboard to witness its journey, mirrors the solitary nature of individual experience, the way each consciousness must ultimately chart its own course through territories that cannot be fully shared with others. As we prepare to close this exploration of history's greatest vanishings, we might recognize that we ourselves are part of the mystery we have been investigating. Our attempts to understand these disappearances are themselves acts of temporary presence in a universe that tends toward absence, momentary arrangements of attention and intention that will eventually dissolve back into the silence from which they emerged. This recognition does not diminish the value of our investigation, but enriches it, suggesting that the search for answers is itself more important than any specific solutions we might discover. The mysteries persist because they serve a function larger than puzzle solving. They maintain space in human consciousness for wonder, for the recognition that existence contains possibilities that exceed our current capacity for understanding. In contemplating these eternal questions, we participate in a tradition that stretches back to the earliest human attempts to make sense of experience. The cave painters of Lascaux were engaged in the same fundamental activity as modern archaeologists studying the Antikythera mechanism, the effort to create meaning from mystery, to find patterns that connect individual experience to larger, cosmic processes. The mysteries we have explored suggest that this effort is not merely intellectual but spiritual, not just a search for information, but a quest for transformation. Each vanishing we have contemplated changes us in subtle ways, expanding our understanding of what it means to be conscious in a universe that contains far more than consciousness can grasp. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not any specific disappearance, but the persistence of mystery itself in a world that often claims to explain everything. The questions that surround these vanishings remind us that explanation and understanding are not identical, that facts and truth operate in different dimensions of experience. As sleep approaches and consciousness prepares for its own temporary vanishing, we might recognize that rest itself is a daily participation in the great mystery of absence and presence. Each night, we surrender voluntary control and allow awareness to dissolve into patterns we cannot direct or fully remember. In this sense, sleep becomes a rehearsal for the ultimate mystery that awaits all conscious beings, the final disappearance that transforms individual existence into participation in processes larger than personal identity. The mysteries we have explored tonight will continue their patient existence, whether we wake to contemplate them tomorrow or not. They remind us that human consciousness is both the questioner and part of the question, both the seeker and part of what is sought. In recognizing this paradox, we touch something essential about the nature of existence itself, the way that awareness emerges from mystery, only to discover that it remains fundamentally mysterious to itself. Let these ancient questions accompany you into sleep, not as problems requiring solutions, but as companions for the journey into rest. The vanishings we have contemplated speak to the eternal rhythm of presence and absence that shapes all existence, the cosmic pulse that carries individual consciousness forward into whatever mysteries await beyond the horizon of current understanding. In the end, perhaps we do not solve mysteries so much as join them, becoming part of the eternal conversation between known and unknown that gives meaning to conscious experience. The greatest vanishing may be the one that transforms questioners into questions, seekers into part of what is sought, individual awareness into participation in the vast patient mystery that surrounds and includes all temporary arrangements of matter, energy, and consciousness. As this exploration concludes and sleep approaches, the mysteries remain, not as failures of explanation, but as invitations to wonder, not as problems unsolved, but as doorways into dimensions of experience that resist complete understanding. They will be waiting when we wake, patient as stars, enduring as stone, ready to remind us once again that existence contains infinitely more than any individual mind can grasp, and that this limitation is not a flaw but a gift, the gift of eternal questions that make each moment of awareness a small miracle in a universe vast enough to contain all possible mysteries, including the mystery of consciousness itself. It takes hours of research, writing, and quiet thought to bring stories like this to life. If you made it this far and still haven't subscribed, seriously, go on, tap it. We'll keep the lantern burning for you.